A warm welcome to today's video explaining the cosmological arguments that you need for philosophy A-level. In this video I will break down the arguments themselves. In the following video I will address the criticisms of these arguments. I hope you find this video helpful. The first argument is the Kalam cosmological argument. This is defended by William Lane Craig. It's simultaneously the oldest and the most contemporary cosmological argument, but you don't need to understand the history to understand and get lots of marks writing about this argument. So in these 3 points of standard form, you should use the standard form. In these 3 points, you'll notice that all that is established is that, if you accept it of course, the universe has a cause. Now it's bridged later on, it's added to by William Lane Craig, the fact that the cause is God, and I'll explain that in a second, but just so we both are clear about what this argument itself establishes, all that it establishes is that the universe has a cause. Now if you are a theist and you believe in God, if you are a Muslim or a Christian, the 2 big audiences for this argument, then it makes perfect sense that you can then bridge this to God, because God is a necessary being. The reason why this can be bridged to prove the existence of God is very simple. The words "that begins to exist" is exceedingly important. The reason is the universe begins to exist, but God did not begin to exist, and that's because God has always and will always exist. God is a necessary being, and so just the argument itself does not establish the existence of God. All that it shows is that the universe has a cause. But if we bridge this out further, what William Craig is trying to do is provide rational evidence for the existence of God. And that's the Kalam cosmological argument. So the second argument is the first way from Aquinas. Aquinas has 5 different ways to show that belief in God is rational. The first way, and actually all 3 of the ways that we need to understand, are cosmological arguments. The first way is from motion. I assume that you can read, and so I'm not going to read out the standard form. Instead, I'll talk you through the key ideas that you need to understand to coherently argue for and against this argument. So the first idea, and actually both of these ideas, are Aristotelian ideas from Aristotle, because Aquinas was rediscovering all of this and making it plausible for the the Christian canon. So actuality, potentiality. All that this means is what actually is happening and what could happen given the conditions. So I'm sat by a campfire, the fire is hot. That is what's going on. That is how the fire is. And so that's the actuality of the situation. But there is potential for the fire to blow out, or for the fire to spread, and hopefully not, but it could cause a forest fire. And so given the conditions, there are things that are actually going on, and there are things that could potentially happen. When we look at the chain of events, the chain of me starting the campfire, that was caused by something that happened before it. I was travelling towards the campsite. Before that, there was a different event, and before that, and before that. And so this, Aquinas is asking us to assume, goes on infinitely. But as we examine that idea in our mind, it seems absurd. And that's where we get the second key idea from Aquinas and from Aristotle, reductio ad absurdum. So the idea with this is we assume that the opposite position is true. We show that it's ridiculous, and so by virtue of the other position seeming ridiculous, you've got to assume that my position is true. So what Aquinas asks us to do is assume that everything is a secondary mover, assume that everything was caused by something that happened before it, assume that that goes on infinitely, and then we run into the obvious absurdity of that situation. So that's the idea. We assume that things go on infinitely, it can't go on infinitely, and so the conclusion is there must be a prime mover. Something must have started the cycle. And we understand that to be God. The next argument is again from Aquinas, but it's an argument from efficient causes. The standard form is here. I recommend you learn that and use it in essays. This is again using some of Aristotle's work, and it's the notion of the four causes. So for each action, let's say a very common example is making a statue. For each action, there is a material cause, a formal cause, an efficient cause, and the final cause. So 4 different causes. Now, the only cause that we need to understand is the efficient causes. And although what I may have just said was a bit confusing, and frankly, it isn't particularly, or at least I don't find it particularly coherent, all that you need to understand is efficient causes. And efficient causes is actually what we, in today's parlance, is what we mean by cause. So, when we say what caused the statue, what we mean in everyday language is who did that and why did they do that? And that's what efficient cause means. So if I see a football rolling across a football pitch, what caused that? Well, it was the football player who kicked it. And why? Well, they were trying to kick it towards the goal. That's one efficient cause, but what Aquinas is trying to do is he's trying to establish that this can't go on infinitely. He's trying to use reductio ad absurdum, and he's trying to show that there must be a first cause that caused the chain, and he wants to show that that's God. So, with motion, what we did was we went vertically back in time. So we looked at one event, and then we went back to look at another event, and then back again, and then back again. And so the chain is going vertically. But for efficient causes, what we're doing is we're going horizontally, we're going up. And so when we see the football rolling across the football pitch, we say, what caused that? Well, the football player caused that. He did that because he wanted to. And so we go up the chain. We ask the same question. Well, why did he want to? What caused that? Well, he had free will. It was his desire. And so we go up. Well, why does he have free will? Why did he have that desire? And so every time we ask the question of efficient causes, we're not going back in time. We're asking for a more complex reason. And ultimately we get more and more complex until we get to God. Because we can't keep getting higher order explanations of efficient causes. It can't go on infinitely. Reductio ad absurdum, the first cause is God. Aquinas' third way is from contingency. And when we say contingency, what we mean is the impermanence of events. So everything that we know as part of God's creation, all events and objects, are contingent. And they will one day be destroyed by time. And because all things in the world are contingent, notice that we're still using reductio ad absurdum here. If everything in the world were contingent, at one time there would be nothing. Now it's evident to Aquinas that there is still objects and events that are happening in the 13th century. They are continuing to happen now in the 21st century. And so if it were true that there were nothing now, which obviously there isn't, then not everything can be contingent. At least one thing must be necessary. And of course, Aquinas thinks that that is God. So, because contingent events are still happening, surely they should have stopped by now, because surely at one time in space and time, nothing was happening. Because at one time nothing was happening, the universe kept going, and it only kept going because of the existence of God. The next argument is from Descartes. Now, if you understand Descartes, and you understand the form of cosmological arguments, this should be really straightforward to wrap your head around. So the standard form is here, use it. I'm going to go through the depth that you need to answer questions on this, because I know that that is what's important when you're writing 12 mark and 5 mark questions. So the first layer of depth is the notion of causation. So what Descartes is using is he's using the cause of his idea of God, and he's using the cause of his continued existence. So you can think of this as like a parallel cosmological argument. He's using two things to prove the existence of God. He's using his idea of God, and he's using his continued existence. Now, the reason why he uses those two things is simple. That's what he has already proved in his meditations. So, to him, his idea of God and his existence, he's already proved using cogito and his clear and distinct ideas. And so he's got to use what he believes is certain knowledge to prove more certain knowledge, because that's the whole point of his foundationalist, rationalist approach. So that's the first layer of depth. The second layer that you need to understand is the causal adjacency principle. This idea sounds complex, it's really simple. The idea is that like cause have like effects. And so Descartes' idea of God can only be caused by something as complex as God. And the only thing as complex as God is God. And it seems circular because it is circular. But don't tell anyone, because the criticisms we will get onto. So they're the two layers of depth that you need. The only other thing that you need to understand, you should understand already, it's the notion of infinite regression. So if we look at the premises here, either the cause of these two things, let's keep it simple, either the cause of my continued existence is caused by something else, like my parents, or it's its own cause. Now, if A is true, so if it's caused by something else, let's say my continued existence is caused by my parents, then eventually it will reach the ultimate cause, God, because we keep tracing it back and God's at the end. So even if my continued existence is not the cause of God, it will trace back long enough to be caused eventually by God. Because Descartes already has an idea of God, he knows that God exists using his ontological argument, and so of course it makes sense that Descartes can make a bridge further, and he's able to bridge to God being the cause of his continued existence. And he uses this and he knows this because, well, of course, an infinite regression is impossible. And so that is Descartes' argument. So the final argument is from Leibniz. Now, Leibniz's argument is from sufficient reason. First, I think it's suiting that we understand what he means when he says the principle of sufficient reason. So this is the idea that all truths can only be called so, we can only have a truth, if we have sufficient reason to believe that it's true. And Leibniz distinguishes between two different types of truth. The first one, and you'll know this if you know Hume's thought, the first one is analytic truths, truths which are necessary, which are true because the opposite is a contradiction, the opposite is impossible. And the second type of truth that we have are contingent truths. These happen to be the case, their opposite is not impossible, it's possible. And that's the notion of sufficient reason. So, for necessary truths, for analytic truths, they can fully be explained just by looking at their own definition, effectively. Contingent truths can only be fully understood using God. And because we take these as truths, we've got to also take the idea that God exists. And here's how. When we analyse the contents of a contingent truth, so this is any claim we take to be true that isn't an analytic truth, the way that we analyse that uncovers more contingent truths. So an example would be H2O boils at 100 degrees Celsius and freezes at 0 degrees Celsius. That's a contingent truth. Now, that only happens to be the case, and we try and fully understand this. We try and create sufficient reason. The only way we can do this is by understanding other contingent truths. And so we go back. And the only way we establish those contingent truths is by going back again. And so as we try and uncover more contingent truths about the world, all that we end up doing is starting a sequence that we can't finish. And so there is an ultimate reason for contingencies, but that explanation, the sufficient reason to end this sequence, this infinite regression, is God. It's a necessary truth. God is a necessary being. God is a necessary truth. And God can help fully explain all contingent truths. And that's Leibniz's argument. So the only thing which can exist outside of creation is God. And so that's why God can explain as a necessary being all things within contingent creation.